And so now on to the gastrointestinal system. First, we'll start with review of the gut anatomy. If you watch the videos, this should all be very much review, but just to get us all oriented. Remember, the gut is one continuous tube. It's about 25 feet long, and it only goes in one direction, mouth to anus. What's interesting about that is that technically, because it's open at both ends, what's inside your gut is technically outside your body. You're kind of a very complicated donut. Um, Not terribly relevant for today since we treat everything inside your gut as if it's inside your body, but interesting thing to keep in mind. At any rate, your gut consists of your mouth, your pharynx or your throat, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, rectum, anus. There are several accessory structures that are derived from mucosal cells of the gut and are critical to the gut function. We've got the organs of mechanical digestion, the teeth and the tongue, and it's worth noting that, of course, some of the proper gut structures are involved in all these forms of digestion as well. Chemical digestion from the salivary glands, and then slightly different from chemical digestion, the gallbladder, liver, and pancreas all release bile or enzymes into the GI tract to further break down your food. Now, pro tip here. If you're looking up some sort of esophageal issue in a textbook or on a website that's produced by a British company, esophagus will begin with the letter O. I don't know how it's actually pronounced if you are British, but in my head it's always O-esophageal, and I have been fooled by that before. So if you're looking that one up and you're somewhere British, start with O. All right, again, this should be familiar if you watched the video, but the basic histology of the gut is as follows. As with any of the other structures we've talked about, the fluid-filled space in the middle is the lumen. The next layer is the mucosa, which, as it sounds, produces mucus that lines the gut tube. It's got a couple different layers, an epithelium, a connective tissue layer called the lamina propria, and then a smooth muscle layer, which, again, this is not muscle action that you're controlling. This is the muscle action that produces peristalsis and other sorts of movement of the gut. The next layer is the submucosa. Now, this is a connective tissue layer that contains multiple tissue types. So that's blood and lymph, glands, nerves. We'll talk a little bit more about the nervous system of the gut later. But the submucosa also connects the mucosa to the muscle layer, which is what's up next. Now, the muscularis layer produces most of the peristalsis, or the sort of pulsing movements of the gut that keep your food and whatever it is you ate moving in one direction, ideally from mouth to anus. Now, depending on where you are in the muscularis, you'll either have smooth or skeletal muscle, and if you have smooth muscle, it'll either be 2 or 3 layers. You get skeletal muscle up in your mouth, your pharynx, the upper part of your esophagus, and your sphincter. And those are all muscles, of course, that I'm sure you know you can control. Whereas within your stomach and large and small intestine, there is muscle, but you cannot control it. And the stomach actually has a third or an extra layer of muscle to produce a churning motion for its contents that's not present in the small and large intestine. The last layer is the serosa. It's formed of connective tissue and epithelium, and it's only present in the portions of the gut that are within the abdominal cavity, so you don't see it, say, up in your pharynx. And I've forgotten all my boxes. Okay, so quick trip back to body folding. Just a reminder, in the picture here on the left, we're looking at an embryo that's in the stages of those primary body folds, cranial, caudal, left or lateral folds, left and right. It's the lateral folds converging on the connecting stalk that internalize the gut tube and actually produce the gut tube. So at that stage, the basic structure of the gut is the oropharyngeal membrane, which is closed, foregut, midgut, hindgut, and the cloacal membrane, which is again closed. So at this stage, you have a double blind-ended tube, not open on either side. Also present is the splanchnic mesoderm, which is currently surrounding the yolk sac and the primitive gut, and it's going to differentiate into several of the different layers of the gut tube, including the lamina propria of the mucosa, the muscle layer of the mucosa, the submucosa, the muscularis, and some of the blood vessels and connective tissue. Now remember, at this stage, the midgut is open to the yolk sac, but it won't stay that way. And I thought it would be helpful here to have a table of the gut derivatives. This one comes out of your book, and it's just a handy reference for what structures are derived from which portions of the gut. Okay, so once you've started making abdominal organs, it is helpful to keep them organized. And while it may look like everything is sort of squished in and very tightly packed on your insides, in reality, there's a fair amount of room for movement. Certainly, if you were to get jostled or bumped about in any significant way, you could see movement. And that's why we've got a number of sort of connective tissue types of structures that hold your internal organs in place. And they also define the different sections of your abdomen. So there's the intraperitoneal viscera, which are sort of all of the things derived from the gut tube, with some of exceptions, and they're within the peritoneal cavity. And they're contained within there by the dorsal mesentery, which is sort of holding everything in place. The retroperitoneal viscera are, and again, viscera are just organs, the abdominal organs. So the retroperitoneal viscera are the ones that originate inside the body wall or near it, and they're outside the peritoneal cavity. So things like your kidneys and your bladder, they're not derivatives of the gut tube, they're not within the peritoneal cavity. The confusing ones are the secondarily retroperitoneal viscera. These are organs that started as derivatives of the gut tube, so they started within the dorsal mesentery, but they end up fusing to the body wall and ultimately being outside the peritoneal cavity. And that's things like your colon, your duodenum, and your pancreas. Finally, the stomach and liver. They're connected to the ventral body wall by a structure called the septum transversum, and that will become the ventral mesentery. So we have a dorsal mesentery and a ventral mesentery, and if you read your book, a number of derivatives of those. These mesenteries and structures support your abdominal organs, and again, they keep them in place. It is worth pointing out as well that the stomach and liver are both derivatives of the foregut, which is sort of an interesting concept given that the liver is such a different kind of tissue, and we'll talk about what it is going forward. Okay, finally, the different foregut ends and the midgut begins. That's actually defined by the presence of the major gut tube arteries. And they're nicely shown in this picture, although I will point out that this picture actually comes from chapter 13 on your vascular system. We'll be doing that next week, but if you're looking for this one, it's in a different chapter. But nonetheless, the different regions of the gut are defined by the arteries that are present in those regions. So for the foregut, there are two separate artery designations. Up the aorta, there are 5 branches that come off sort of in the general upper chest area of the baby, and that defines the upper part of the foregut, whereas the celiac artery defines the lower part of the foregut. And that includes the abdominal foregut, the abdominal esophagus, the stomach, and the cranial end of the duodenum, which is the connection between the stomach and the small intestine. The midgut is defined by the superior mesenteric trunk, and the hindgut is defined by the inferior mesenteric arteries.